The Untold Story of the Louisiana Purchase. Cold open. Here it is. The promise, right at the top, no waiting. The Louisiana Purchase was not a real estate deal. It was not two calm leaders shaking hands over a map. It was a panicked escape. A secret born out of screaming jungles, burning ships, and a plague that killed faster than any army in history. The man who truly made the Louisiana Purchase happen was never invited to the signing table. He never got a statue in Paris. He never got a line in most textbooks. He was chained in a cold mountain prison while the deal was being written, and he died there alone before he ever learned what he had done. No cameras existed to capture his final days. No newspaper sent a reporter to interview him in that cell. History simply moved on without him, the way a river moves on after a stone sinks beneath the surface, the ripples spreading outward long after the stone itself is forgotten. Stay with me to the end, because his name is coming. And once you hear it, you will never think about this simple land deal the same way again. This is the story America does not tell you in school. This is the untold story of the Louisiana Purchase. 1. The deal that was never supposed to happen. Let's start with a number that should stop you in your tracks. $15 million. That is what the United States paid France in 1803 for 828,000 square miles of land. That is land that would one day become all or part of 15 American states. Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, parts of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Texas. Do the math on that, and it comes out to about 3 cents an acre. 3 cents. It sounds like the greatest bargain in human history, and in some ways, it was. But here's the part that gets left out of the story. President Thomas Jefferson never asked to buy any of that. He sent his men to Paris to buy one single city, New Orleans. That's it. That was the whole plan. Why New Orleans? Because in 1803, if you were a farmer in Kentucky or Ohio or Tennessee, your entire livelihood depended on a river. The Mississippi River was the highway of the American frontier. Farmers loaded their corn, their tobacco, their flour onto flatboats and floated it down that river to one port, New Orleans. From there, ships carried it to the rest of the world. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled whether an American farmer's family ate that year or starved. Picture a farmer in the Ohio Valley in the year 1802. He has spent months clearing land, planting corn, and praying the weather cooperates. Come harvest, he loads his crop onto a flatboat, a simple raft of logs, and pushes off into the current. He has no roads to speak of. No railroads exist yet. The river is his only path to market, and New Orleans is the only door at the end of it. If that door closes, everything he worked for rots on the dock, and his family goes hungry through the winter. This was not an abstract political concern. It was survival, plain and simple, for tens of thousands of families spread across the frontier. And in 1802, word reached Jefferson that Spain had secretly handed Louisiana, including New Orleans, back to France. That news hit Washington like a thunderclap. Spain was old, tired, and weak. France was different. France was led by a brilliant, terrifying young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who dreamed of empires the way other men dream of breakfast. Jefferson was afraid, not politely concerned, afraid. He wrote a letter that year with a line so blunt it still shocks historians today. He said that the day France took possession of New Orleans, America would have to marry itself to the British Navy, because France sitting on that river was a threat America could not survive alone. Think about that for a second. Thomas Jefferson, the man who distrusted Britain more than almost anyone in American politics, was ready to team up with his country's old enemy just to stop Napoleon from choking off the Mississippi. So Jefferson sent 2 men to Paris with clear, narrow instructions. Robert Livingston was already stationed there as the American minister to France. Jefferson added James Monroe to the team and gave them a budget of up to $10 million. Their job was simple: buy New Orleans. Maybe buy a strip of Florida too, if possible. Under no circumstances were they authorized to buy the whole territory. Nobody in Washington was even thinking that big. Jefferson genuinely believed this might fail. He prepared backup plans in case France refused to sell anything at all. He considered what alliances America might need to form, what pressure the young nation could apply, and how long farmers along the frontier could hold out if the port stayed closed. He was a president bracing for disappointment, not a president expecting to double the size of his country in a single stroke of a pen. Picture Monroe on that ship, standing at the rail, watching the American coastline shrink behind him. He believed he understood his mission completely. Sail to Paris, help Livingston get a city, come home a hero for securing the frontier's future. Simple, contained, manageable. He had packed for a negotiation over a port. He had no idea he was sailing toward one of the biggest surprises in the history of diplomacy. Monroe boarded a ship in March of 1803, not knowing that history had already started moving without him. Because somewhere far south of Paris, on a Caribbean island most Americans could not have found on a map, A nightmare was unfolding for Napoleon. And that nightmare, not diplomacy, not friendships, not generosity, is the real reason the offer on the table would soon become something far bigger than anyone in Washington ever imagined. What was happening on that island would break an empire's back. And it starts with a promise Napoleon made and then broke to a man he should have feared. 2. Napoleon's secret empire and the island. He needed to understand why Napoleon suddenly wanted to sell all of Louisiana. You have to understand what he actually wanted Louisiana for in the first place. Napoleon did not want cornfields in Missouri. He barely thought about the frontier at all. What Napoleon wanted was sugar. In 1803, the single most profitable colony on planet Earth was a small island in the Caribbean called Saint-Domingue. Today we know it as Haiti. It produced more sugar and coffee than almost anywhere else on the globe, and that wealth poured straight into France. But there was a catch, and it was a brutal one. That wealth was built entirely on the backs of enslaved people. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children had been kidnapped from Africa and forced to work the sugar fields under conditions so horrific that enslaved workers on Saint-Domingue often did not survive more than a few years. Picture the harbor at the island's capital in the years before the rebellion. Ships lined up for miles, their hulls stacked with barrels of sugar and sacks of coffee beans, more wealth flowing out of that single port than out of many entire countries combined. It made colonists rich beyond imagination, and it made France's treasury swell along with them. That wealth came at a human price almost too painful to describe, paid for in the broken backs and shortened lives of the very people who had never asked to be there. Napoleon needed Saint-Domingue to stay profitable, and he needed a mainland breadbasket nearby to feed it. That breadbasket was supposed to be Louisiana. Grain and livestock would flow from the Mississippi Valley down to feed the enslaved workforce in the Caribbean, and sugar and coffee would flow back to France, and Napoleon's empire would grow richer and stronger by the year. It was a clean plan on paper. Louisiana would be quiet farmland, worked by French settlers, feeding an island most of them would never even visit. No glory, no adventure. Just wheat, corn, and cattle floated down the Mississippi and shipped south to keep the real prize running. There was only one problem. The people of Saint-Domingue had other ideas. In 1791, years before Napoleon even took power in France, enslaved people on the island rose up in the largest and most successful slave rebellion in recorded history. They burned plantations. They fought French troops, Spanish troops, and British troops one after another for over a decade. And they had a leader whose name would eventually terrify Napoleon more than any European king, Toussaint Louverture. He had been born enslaved. He taught himself to read. He studied military strategy. And by the time the world caught up to what was happening on that island, Toussaint had become a general so skilled that European powers with centuries of military tradition could not defeat him. By 1801, Toussaint had done something almost unthinkable. He had taken control of the island, ended slavery there, and written a new constitution. He still claimed loyalty to France on paper. But everyone, including Napoleon, understood the truth. Saint-Domingue was no longer really France's colony. It belonged to the people who had freed themselves. Napoleon could not accept that, not because of the money alone, though the money mattered enormously. He could not accept it because a colony of formerly enslaved people successfully governing themselves was, to him and to slaveholders everywhere, a threat that had to be crushed before the idea spread. So, in the final weeks of 1801, Napoleon assembled one of the largest military expeditions France had ever sent across an ocean. 20,000 soldiers, some of France's most experienced and hardened troops, warships, cannons, supplies. He placed his own brother-in-law in command, a general named Charles Leclerc, married to Napoleon's beloved sister, Pauline. Napoleon's orders were quiet, but unmistakable. Retake the island, disarm the population, and, eventually, restore slavery. Leclerc sailed for Saint-Domingue in December of 1801, full of confidence, carrying his wife and young son with him on the voyage, believing this would be a short campaign and a glorious homecoming. He had no idea what he was actually sailing into. Think about that scene for a moment. A young family crossing an ocean together, believing they were heading toward a short posting and a proud homecoming. Pauline packed dresses for garden parties. Leclerc packed his ambition. Neither of them packed for what was actually waiting on the other side of that water, because the island was about to fight back with a weapon no French general had prepared for. A weapon with no army, no uniform, no mercy. And it was already waiting for them in the humid air. 3. The island that brought an empire to its knees. At first, it looked like Napoleon's plan was working. Leclerc's forces landed in early 1802 and pushed hard. Through trickery and overwhelming force, French troops eventually captured Toussaint Louverture himself. He was arrested under a false promise of safe negotiation, then shipped across the ocean to France in chains. He was locked inside a cold mountain fortress in the Jura region, a place called Fort de Joux, far from the warmth of the island he had freed. He was kept in near isolation, poorly fed, and denied warm clothing suited for the freezing French winter. Toussaint Louverture, the man who had outthought and outfought European empires for over a decade, spent his final months alone in a stone cell, his health failing, his voice unheard by the very government that feared him enough to imprison him. He died there in April of 1803, likely of pneumonia and neglect. Try to hold that image for a moment. A man who once commanded thousands, who had outplanned generals trained at the finest military academies in Europe, reduced to a thin blanket and a barred window, coughing in the dark, utterly forgotten by the government that once trembled at the sound of his name. No visitors, no allies, no word from the island he had risked everything to free. He never lived to see what his life's work would ultimately force into being. He never knew that the ripple effects of his rebellion were about to reshape a continent he had never even visited. Because back on the island, capturing Toussaint did not end the fight. If anything, it lit a new fire. His former generals, men like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, took up the cause with even greater ferocity, now fighting not just for freedom, but for vengeance. The rebellion did not fade after Toussaint's capture. It grew fiercer, angrier, and harder to stop. And then came the second enemy, one that did not carry a musket, did not need an army, and did not care whether you wore a French uniform or fought alongside the rebels, yellow fever. The disease swept through Leclerc's camps with horrifying speed. French soldiers who had marched through European battlefields without flinching were reduced to shaking, fevered, dying men within days. Historians estimate that disease killed far more of Leclerc's troops than combat ever did. Some estimates suggest that of the roughly 34,000 French soldiers eventually sent to the island across the campaign, more than 24,000 died, the overwhelming majority from illness rather than battle wounds. Picture that for a moment. Ships packed with young French soldiers, many barely out of their teens, arriving full of confidence and then dying by the thousands in tents and makeshift hospitals, thousands of miles from home in a war that was slipping further out of their control every single week. Imagine writing a letter home to your mother in a French village, describing a place so hot the air itself feels like a threat, watching the soldier in the cot next to you shake with fever one night, be gone by morning. Imagine wondering if the letter you are writing will arrive after you are already dead. That was daily life for Leclerc's army by the middle of 1802. Leclerc himself began writing increasingly desperate letters back to Napoleon. He begged for more troops. He warned that the situation was collapsing. He described a war that could not be won the way it was being fought. And then, in November of 1802, Leclerc got yellow fever too. He died on the island, far from Pauline and their son, far from his brother-in-law's palace in Paris, a broken and defeated man commanding an army that was rotting away beneath him. When the news reached Napoleon, it did not just arrive as a battlefield report. It arrived as a death in the family. And that death, more than any single battle report, seems to have finally shattered Napoleon's dream of a Caribbean and American empire. But even then, even with his brother-in-law dead and his army dying by the thousands, Napoleon did not immediately give up. There is one more piece of this puzzle, one more war closing in on him from a completely different direction. A war that would force his hand once and for all. Because Napoleon was not just losing an island, he was about to lose the peace in Europe too. Somewhere in Paris, in a palace far from the fever and the ash, a man who had never lost a war in his own mind was forced to sit with a truth he did not want to accept. His sister was a widow, his army was a graveyard, and his empire in the Americas was already gone, whether he admitted it out loud or not. 4. A brother's death. An empire in ashes. Grief does strange things to powerful men. Sometimes it makes them retreat. Sometimes it makes them lash out. For Napoleon, in the early months of 1803, grief and cold, strategic calculation arrived at the exact same conclusion, at the exact same time. Louisiana was worthless to him now. Think about the logic. The entire reason Napoleon wanted Louisiana was to feed and supply Saint-Domingue. But Saint-Domingue was disintegrating. The rebellion Toussaint had started was now unstoppable, led by generals who would go on to declare full independence in 1804. Creating the nation of Haiti, the first nation in the world, founded by formerly enslaved people who overthrew their enslavers. Napoleon's dream colony was already lost in every way that mattered, even though the final declaration hadn't happened yet. If Saint-Domingue was gone, why would Napoleon need a massive, hard-to-defend territory in North America, a place he had almost no soldiers to protect, sitting right next to a growing and increasingly ambitious United States, and worse, sitting dangerously close to territory controlled by Britain, France's oldest and most dangerous enemy? And that is where the second crisis comes crashing in. By early 1803, the fragile peace between France and Britain, known as the Peace of Amiens, was falling apart. War was coming again, and everyone in Europe could feel it. Napoleon knew that when war resumed, the powerful British Navy would almost certainly try to seize Louisiana, especially New Orleans, simply to strangle American trade and deny France any foothold in North America. So Napoleon faced a brutal, clear-eyed choice. He could try to hold on to Louisiana with an empty treasury, a shattered military reputation from the Caribbean disaster, and almost no way to defend it from the British Navy. Or he could sell it to the one nation that would jump at the chance to buy it, sell it for enough money to help refill his war chest for the coming fight against Britain. And in the same stroke, hand Britain's biggest rival, the United States, a massive strategic gift, ensuring America would grow strong enough to one day be a counterweight to British power. It was cold. It was calculated. And it was also, in its own strange way, an act of grief. Napoleon's dream of a French-American empire had died, along with his brother-in-law, on that island. There was nothing left to protect. There was something almost unbearably human buried in that decision. A man who conquered nearly all of Europe, who rarely let go of anything without a fight, quietly deciding to release the largest single piece of territory he had ever held, not out of generosity, but because the person the whole plan had been built around was already in the ground. So in April of 1803, Napoleon called in his finance minister, a man named François Barbe Marbois, someone who had actually lived in the United States years earlier and understood Americans far better than most French officials. Napoleon gave him stunning instructions. Forget New Orleans alone. Offer the Americans everything. All of Louisiana. Barbe Marbois was floored. So was almost everyone else in Napoleon's government. This was not a small adjustment to a negotiating position. This was Napoleon voluntarily giving up an entire continent's worth of French territory, sight unseen, all at once. And, on the other side of the ocean, an American diplomat named Robert Livingston, who had spent months trying and failing to get France to even discuss selling New Orleans, was about to walk into a meeting that would change absolutely everything. He thought he was going to negotiate for a city. He had no idea he was about to be offered a continent. Imagine sitting across a table from a man, expecting the same slow, frustrating answer you have heard for months, and instead hearing him casually offer you a piece of the world larger than most European countries combined. That is roughly what was about to happen to Livingston. No warning, no build-up. Just a stunning question that would rewrite the size of his own country before the meeting even ended. 5. The offer. Nobody in America was ready for. Picture Robert Livingston in Paris in early April of 1803. For months, he had been getting nowhere. Polite meetings, vague promises, no real progress on buying New Orleans. He was frustrated, and he had started to wonder if this entire mission would end in failure. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Barbe Marbois requested a meeting. What he offered Livingston in that room must have felt almost unreal. Not just New Orleans, not just a slice of Florida, all of it. The entire territory of Louisiana, an area so vast that nobody in Europe or America had ever precisely mapped its borders. Livingston, stunned, tried to keep his composure and negotiate like the seasoned diplomat he was, but he was working almost entirely without instructions for a deal this size, because nobody back in Washington had ever imagined France would offer this. Just days later, James Monroe finally arrived in Paris, fresh off his ocean crossing, ready to help negotiate for New Orleans, exactly as Jefferson had instructed. Instead, Livingston met him with the most shocking briefing of Monroe's diplomatic career. France wasn't just willing to sell a city, France was willing to sell an empire. The two Americans faced an agonizing problem. They had no legal authority to buy the whole territory. Jefferson's instructions were specific, and this deal went far beyond them. There was no time to sail back to Washington, ask permission, and sail back to Paris. Napoleon could change his mind any day. The political winds in Europe were shifting fast, with war against Britain looming. So Livingston and Monroe made a bold, nerve-wracking decision. They chose to negotiate the deal anyway, and worry about approval later. After tense back-and-forth negotiations over price, the two sides landed on a figure, $15 million total, which included the purchase price itself, plus resolving certain financial claims American citizens had against France. The treaty documents were signed at the end of April 1803, though famously dated April 30th, to avoid conflicting with the resumed war between France and Britain that had just broken out. There's a story, often repeated by historians, that after the treaty was signed, Livingston turned to the others in the room and said something to the effect that they had just completed the noblest work of their entire lives. It was, in terms of sheer size and consequence, one of the largest peaceful land transfers in history. But back in the United States, Jefferson faced his own agonizing crisis. Jefferson was, famously, one of the strictest believers in limiting the power of the federal government. He had spent years arguing that the Constitution only allowed the government to do what it explicitly said it could do. And nowhere did the Constitution say the president could simply buy a foreign territory twice the size of the existing country. Jefferson actually drafted a constitutional amendment to formally authorize the purchase, wrestling with his own principles late into the night. But his advisors warned him that the process would take too long and that Napoleon might change his mind, or that Britain might seize the territory first once war resumed. Time was the one thing Jefferson did not have. So Jefferson, the man who preached strict limits on presidential power louder than almost anyone in American history, made the painful choice to set his own principles aside and push the treaty through Congress without a constitutional amendment. He justified it as an emergency of national survival. The Senate ratified the treaty in October of 1803. On December 20th, 1803, in a ceremony in New Orleans, the French flag came down and the American flag rose in its place. Overnight, the size of the United States doubled. Farmers up and down the Mississippi Valley could finally breathe easy. Their trade route was secure. Their future was secure. Jefferson had, almost by accident, secured the most consequential land deal in American history. Americans celebrated. Newspapers praised Jefferson's wisdom. Bells rang in towns along the frontier. Farmers who had spent years worrying about a foreign flag on their only trade route finally let themselves believe their future was secure. Schoolchildren for the next 2 centuries would learn about the brilliant diplomacy of Livingston and Monroe and the vision of Jefferson. But somewhere far away, in a cold stone cell in the mountains of France, the true reason any of this happened had already been buried and forgotten. And it's time, finally, to say his name out loud. 6. The man history forgot, and the truth behind the deal. Here is the truth that so rarely makes it into the story. The Louisiana Purchase happened because Napoleon's Caribbean Empire collapsed. Napoleon's Caribbean Empire collapsed because of a rebellion led by people who had once been enslaved, refusing to accept their chains any longer. And that rebellion was shaped, inspired, and led for over a decade by one man, Toussaint Louverture. He was born into slavery on that island. He rose through sheer intelligence and force of will to command armies and outmaneuver some of the most powerful militaries on earth. He built a functioning government in the middle of chaos. He gave hundreds of thousands of people their freedom, and he held on to that freedom against wave after wave of foreign invasion. Think about what courage that took. He was not just fighting for his own life. He was fighting so that his children, and the children of everyone around him, would never again know the sound of a whip or the weight of another person's chains. He carried that responsibility through years of war, through betrayal, through disease and hunger, never once trading the freedom of his people for his own safety. Napoleon feared him enough to trick him into a meeting, arrest him, and ship him across the ocean in chains, locking him away in a remote fortress where the cold and neglect would kill him within months. Napoleon thought that removing Toussaint from the island would break the rebellion's spirit. He was wrong. The rebellion did not die with Toussaint's capture. It grew stronger, angrier, and more determined, ultimately leading to Haiti's full independence in 1804, less than a year after the Louisiana Purchase was finalized, and less than a year after Toussaint died alone in that French prison cell. Without that rebellion, Napoleon never sends Leclerc and 20,000 soldiers across the ocean. Without that expedition, 24,000 French soldiers never die of yellow fever in the Caribbean heat. Without those catastrophic losses, Leclerc never dies far from home, and Napoleon never loses the brother-in-law whose death seemed to break his heart for the whole colonial project. Without that devastating personal and military loss, Napoleon almost certainly does not walk into a meeting in April 1803 and casually offer to sell the largest territorial land deal in American history. Every piece connects. Pull out any single one, and the story falls apart. Toussaint Louverture, a man who never set foot in Louisiana, who likely never even heard the name Thomas Jefferson, is one of the central reasons the borders of the United States look the way they do today. He died without ever knowing that his fight for freedom on a small Caribbean island had reshaped an entire continent thousands of miles away. He died believing, perhaps, that his life's work might be undone the moment he was gone. He never got to see Haiti declare its independence just months later. He never got to see the ripple effects roll all the way to the Mississippi River. History textbooks love clean, tidy stories. Jefferson wanted land. Napoleon needed money. A deal was struck. Everyone was happy. Roll credits. It is easier to teach it that way. It fits neatly on a page. It does not require explaining slavery or rebellion or a prison cell in the mountains of France. It does not require sitting with the uncomfortable truth that one of the greatest expansions in American history was made possible by a revolution most Americans have never been taught to name. But easier is not the same as true, and the people who lived through the real version deserve to have their part of the story told. But the real story is messier, sadder, and far more human than that. It is a story about grief, about a general who lost his brother-in-law, and with him, his appetite for an empire. It is a story about disease, an invisible enemy that did more damage to Napoleon's army than any cannon ever could. It is a story about a farmer in Ohio whose future depended entirely on decisions made by men he never met and a river he desperately needed to keep open. It is a story about a young widow in Paris, Pauline, who lost her husband to a war she never chose on an island she never asked him to sail toward. And at the very center of it all, it is the story of a man who was enslaved, who freed himself and hundreds of thousands of others, who outfought empires, and who died alone in the cold, never knowing that his courage was the true, hidden cornerstone of the Louisiana Purchase. So the next time someone tells you the Louisiana Purchase was simply a smart deal between Jefferson and Napoleon, you will know better. You will know about Saint-Domingue. You will know about Leclerc and the fever that swept through his camps. You will know about a cold fortress in the mountains of France where a revolutionary died forgotten. And you will know his name, Toussaint Louverture. Remember it, because without him, there may never have been a Louisiana Purchase at all. Think about how strange history really is. A president who almost went to war to protect one river port ended up doubling the size of his country because of a battle fought on an island he never visited, against an army he never commanded, sparked by a man he likely never met, and rarely, if ever, thought about. A farmer plowing a field in Ohio in the 1820s had no idea that his land, his home, his entire future existed because thousands of enslaved people thousands of miles away refused to go back into chains. A settler building a cabin in Missouri never imagined that the ground beneath his feet had been protected in a roundabout and painful way by a rebellion most history books barely mention. That is what makes this story so powerful and so important to remember. History rarely moves in straight lines. It moves through unexpected connections, through grief and disease and courage, through decisions made in desperation as often as decisions made in wisdom. The tidy version, the one where two rational leaders sat down and struck a fair deal, leaves out almost everything that actually mattered. The real story includes a man who died alone in a freezing cell, having never known that his fight for freedom would echo all the way to the Rocky Mountains. It includes a general who buried his ambition along with his brother-in-law. It includes thousands of unnamed soldiers on both sides who never made it home. And it includes a young country that grew twice as large almost overnight, built on the ashes of somebody else's revolution. So the next time you see a map of the United States, look at that wide stretch running from the Mississippi to the Rockies, and remember, it was never really about the money or the land or the diplomats in that room in Paris. It was about a man in chains, an island on fire, and a dream of empire that died in the fever-soaked air of the Caribbean, thousands of miles from the treaty table where the world believed the whole story began. That is the untold story of the Louisiana Purchase. End of script.